Throughout U.S. history, cities have been intentionally submerged underwater to make way for a man-made lake, reservoir, or dam. The village of Zoar, Ohio was spared once. Will it be so lucky the next time? Here's its story.
History is alive in the small Tuscarawas County village of Zoar. From the horses that still carry passengers through the town,
welcome to the #1 house,
to the meticulously restored historic buildings.
My grandfather was born here, raised here.
To the descendants who return for the historic Zoar Harvest Festival each August.
Well, the festival is great because it brings people to Zoar. They get to appreciate, again, the history and the culture of Zoar while they're having fun, whether they're interested in antiques.
Oh, it's a ladle, but it's probably old, judging from the price.
Fine crafts or the art.
Isn't that beautiful?
Or whether they just want to come and have a beer and listen to music.
While accommodating the preferences of today's crowds, Zoar holds fast to the roots first planted back in 1817. At that time, a group of Germans were fed up with the religious and economic persecution they were enduring in their home region of Württemberg. They were being forced to conform to the conventions of the state-run Lutheran Church. Their property and their children were being taken from them. A 39-year-old pipe maker and minister from Ulm, Joseph Beimler, led about 300 of them to America with help from the Society of Friends, or Quakers.
When they landed in Philadelphia, they had no money. And the Quakers put them up and loaned them the money to buy the land out here.
They purchased 5,000 acres for a reported $16,000. In the fall of 1817, Beimler and the first group of immigrants arrived in eastern Ohio. They started building the community they would call Zoar.
They named it Zoar, which means refuge. It's taken from the Bible. It's the town that Lot fled to through Sodom and Gomorrah.
This is original, the 1817, and then the porch was added on in like 1828.
Many of the original buildings still stand, including this cabin bought by the late Don Whittemire in 1979. The company he started, Whittemire Advertising, still flourishes in this tiny town under the guidance of Don's son, Tim.
It's been a very creative location. We're in an old log cabin here that's a lot better than being in a cubicle all day long, much more creative environment. We're a business-to-business agency, and we're sort of right smack in the middle of a triangle between Cleveland, Columbus, and Pittsburgh, where there's just a lot of business-to-business manufacturers. So it's actually geographically, it's a perfect location for us.
Images of Zoar fill the walls of the agency each year during the annual art contest Whittemire sponsors. It's evidence of the community spirit in Zoar that's not lost on outsiders who've come to do work here.
I jokingly say that in my neighborhood, if my neighbors moved, I wouldn't notice. Here people seem to have a tight-knit community identity, I suppose. My background is in historic preservation and planning, so I was very impressed with the historical integrity of the village. Certainly it retained an appearance of an early 19th century village in a way many communities in America do not anymore.
This beautiful historic village, it's not replaceable, and it's one of the only living villages, I think, in the United States. It's a working living village. It's not anything like a regular museum, so I think it should be saved.
The feeling in Zoar is unique. It's a feeling that everybody had when they lived in their little old hometown, and the neighbors cared about each other, and they worried about who was sick and whether they had enough to eat. And it's the same kind of feeling that exists in Zoar today.
That feeling was established from the beginning. After the first group of Germans came to Zoar, the remaining 200 or so followed in the spring of 1818. It was difficult to survive. Individually, they had little. It was suggested that they could do better if they pooled their resources. In April 1819, they decided to band together to form the Society of Separatists of Zoar.
They had to communize everything. They made it a communal settlement. All the property became the property of the society. If you lived in the society, you owned nothing, not even the clothes on your back. But you were free to go, and if you decided to leave the society, you were outfitted, you were given funds, and you were free to go and even come back. They even took some back.
Every Friday at 1 o'clock, a representative of each household would come to pick up the goods that they needed.
Equality was essential in Zoar. Everyone got the same amount of weekly goods. and Zoar was a forerunner in treating women as equals.
One of the fascinating little stories about Zoar is that the Zoar women had the right to vote on all local issues when the women had no right to vote in America. Now, they could not vote for national or state offices, but they could vote. They had a voice vote here in the community, which was almost unheard of.
We have the talents to do what needs done.
Women, who originally outnumbered the men 2-to-1, played a significant role in the success of Zoar. In the early days, the community agreed to a rule of celibacy that lasted 8 years, allowing the women time to work instead of raising children. When the town had an opportunity to earn significant dollars digging a 7-mile stretch of the Ohio and Erie Canal, women worked alongside the men, hauling away the dirt in baskets. The canal work earned the community more than $20,000 and was pivotal to Zoar's future prosperity.
By digging the canal, the Zoarites were able to pay off their loan from the Quakers and then buy this land and really turn it into a very successful economic story. At their peak, they had millions of dollars. They owned 7,000 some acres of land. They had 2 iron furnaces. They had a leather shop, a blacksmith shop. They were pretty well self-sufficient, and they exported. They shipped beer to Cleveland. They shipped goods to Cleveland, certainly wheat to Cleveland, and they became very important, an important economic driver of this area.
And when I turn this, it turns this edge up, you see?
Wow.
And as I keep turning it around more and more, it'll turn up and look just like that. That would be a bottom of possibly of a cup.
From the tinsmith to the tanner, Zoar businesses thrived. And when the Ohio and Erie Canal was completed, the community welcomed another industry.
Even in the 19th century, the Zoarites recognized that they had a kind of a tourist gem here. And so they had a small hotel over on the canal, which appealed to canal travelers as they were going. They stopped overnight. But they recognized they needed more than that, so they built a large hotel in the center of Zoar, the Zoar Hotel, which is still there, not as a hotel, but it's a historically preserved building. And they built that specifically for tourist visitors. And then in around the 1890s, that was expanded even more, probably doubled in size.
By all accounts, most Zoarites were content, and history indicates few problems.
This was a town that had no crime in all the years from 1817 or 1898. There was no crime in the town. They did have a jail, but it was mainly for some of the folks that were at the hotel that over-imbibed, and they spent the night and sent them on their way. It was a community that everybody had all their needs met. They had a place to stay, they had their clothing, they had food, and they had to work for it, of course, but it was one of those kind of examples of American ingenuity that today the people would say, we're capitalism, we don't want anything to do with that kind of thing. But then, at that time, it was because of survival for these individuals.
Work and the provisions they received from the community were not the only things that sustained the Zoarites. Something you'll see around the village even today are gardens at each home. And you can't miss the large, centrally located, well-cared-for Garden of Happiness.
We're in the garden, and this is the center of town. And it was really important to the Zoarites. It was their place of refuge. That's what Zoar means. In the 1930s, when Zoar was beginning to be restored, this was the first thing that the residents and descendants did. They fixed up the garden and planted this big tree here in that era. We think it's about 80 years old, 75 some years old. It's really an important part of town. People from all over the country come here, stop, they want to sit underneath the tree and just, again, find that place of refuge, just like the Zoarites did.
Zoar hosts a garden tour every other year. It shares its history with youngsters, hosts Civil War reenactors, and welcomes tourists from around the globe. Ironically, the first tourists enchanted by Zoar back in the 1800s may have inadvertently brought about the end of the successful communist society.
The hotel here was a very vibrant part of the community. Some say it was also what really contributed to the demise of the community, because more and more the people saw the outside world and were exposed to it.
And they started seeing how other people lived and the other people's clothing, and the people that came to the Zoar Hotel, they would see them and started envying their lifestyle. And it got to the point where they decided to take a vote in 1898 in August and September. And when they took the vote, they decided to disband. and all people either got a place to stay or acreage of land or part of animals and things like that.
One report indicates it amounted to about $2,000 each, a seemingly paltry sum compared to the priceless legacy their efforts left.
They really did end up as a good society and a caring society and a model for ingenuity of how to survive, and basically in a period of time that saw horses to industrial revolution.
I've lived here 4 years, and this is the second time in 4 years, and I wonder why I moved here. I'm a nervous wreck, and I don't have flood insurance because I'm not in a flood zone.
In the 21st century, Zoar is fighting a natural adversary, water. Twice in the past decade, roads have flooded, so much so at times that even schools shut down.
The kids have been off sometimes up to 2 weeks because they cannot get them to school.
It's a relatively new problem.
All of our records that we could see during the normal time of occupation here, even in 1913, there was no flooding in Zoar, even though downriver there was that deadly flooding.
A problem that grew out of a solution.
The flood that got everybody excited was the flood of 1913, and it affected the state of Ohio. The Dayton area, Columbus area, this area.
Essentially, the flood of 1913 was a devastating flood. Several lives lost, significant economic damage. So the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District started working on a comprehensive plan for flood control and water conservation throughout the basin.
The district developed the plan in the late 1920s. It called for construction of 14 flood control reservoirs in the Muskingum River Basin. The basin stretches from southern Summit County all the way south to the state line in Washington County. In 1933, the Public Works Administration awarded the Army Corps of Engineers a $22 million grant to build the projects.
Even while they were building dams, they had floods in 35 and 38. And what are we going to do with some of these towns? The town of Tappan down in Harrison County had to be moved. It was behind Tappan Dam. We got Summerdale we got to be concerned with. We have Zoar. We have Sandyville. For the town here of Sandyville, they had to move it, and it moved up to its present location. They moved lock, stock, and barrel, everything that they had here up to that place. Stores, houses, everything.
But Zoar was spared such drastic measures. It did not have to move as Sandyville did. Instead, planners opted to protect it.
Zoar Levee was a result of the construction of Dover Dam. When they were planning the construction of Dover Dam, they looked at what areas would be affected upstream of Dover Dam when we're impounding water and holding back water upstream of Dover Dam. The village of Zoar was one of those areas that would have been inundated otherwise. So rather than relocate the village back in the 1930s, the decision was made to construct a levee around the village.
This levee was really built, based on the data we've assessed, to protect the village based on its historic significance. So if you will, this has been a historic preservation project from day one.
And yet in 1935, 1936, it was recognized by the Corps and the federal government that Zoar was an asset, a resource, a historical resource worth preserving.
The levee the Corps built to protect Zoar extends nearly 1,600 feet, a grassy, inconspicuous elevation protecting this historic village from water it had never worried about before the flood control project. A smaller diversion dam at nearby Goose Run Creek works in tandem with the levee to keep Zoar dry. Back in the 1930s, it was not an inexpensive project to construct.
And it wasn't a time of great economic flourishing. It was a time of the Depression, and yet they still spent the money here to preserve historic Zoar. They built a levee, and the levee has sat there for the last 75 years. However, in the last 6 years, we've had 3 100-year floods, and the levee has shown that it could fail.
The flood event in January 2005, we had some what we call minor boils, and that's basically the evidence of seepage coming underneath the levee and then surfacing on the inside of the levee. Boils are not necessarily a bad thing as long as the seepage is not transporting soil particles with it and the water is clear coming up on the inside, and then the flow rates aren't substantial, then we're okay. But what we saw in 2005 caused us enough concern that we did take some emergency actions in 2005 to address those boils, and then also again in 2008.
The Corps hauled in 39,000 tons of gravel, laying down a blanket of it to prevent levee erosion. It also installed a third pump at the pump station where water is pumped away from the levee and back into the Tuscarawas River. A generator is also now in place at that pump station. The Corps is monitoring the levee closely.
In its current condition, we feel confident that the Zoar Levee can essentially withstand a pool loading of the Tuscarawas River up to elevation 909, which is what we would categorize as about a 90-year event, which really means a little greater than a 1% chance of happening each and every year.
But recognizing its weaknesses, the Corps of Engineers classified as urgent and compelling the need for safety action at Zoar Levee. It's a situation that's created uncertainty and economic challenges for people who live in Zoar.
Because the levee is not performing as designed, we're now in a floodplain, and so anybody that has a mortgage also has to then take flood insurance. So that's affecting them a bit economically, besides the stress and trauma of not knowing whether they're going to have their house and also knowing what the value of it is.
For a community so steeped in its history, it's hard to know what the future holds. But that history of resourcefulness, hard work, and prosperity will undoubtedly serve to guide them in the days ahead.
The people that live here in the village are some of the greatest people in the United States of America. I understand that the natural sentiment could be, yeah, that's the big bad federal government and they're out to do whatever they want to do. But the residents here have not had that attitude whatsoever. They treat us like we're one of their own, and we sit down with them face to face in monthly meetings and have good, meaningful dialogue and correspondence back and forth.
Take this with you if you would.
Zoar is encouraging that correspondence with the Army Corps of Engineers. It wants people who value the village and appreciate its historical significance to write to the Corps and let them know. The Corps welcomes it.
We encourage their input. We need data, information, their public opinion. All of this matters, and it's critical to the successful completion of the report.
The report will come after an intense study initiated in the spring of 2011.
This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News.
The study is being guided by new regulations implemented by the federal government in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. The new guidelines were approved in 2007, and the Corps is required to use them as it tries to determine the best way to address the leaking levee in Zoar. They've begun a dam safety modification study, expected to take 18 months, based on the new law.
Which required us to evaluate non-structural alternatives on an equitable basis as structural alternatives. A structural alternative is a way to address the problem with the structure being the levee and diversion dam. A non-structural alternative is a way to remove those things that are at risk, or in other ways, move the water away from those things that are at risk. And there's a broad array of non-structural alternatives. Acquisition, of course, is the big scary one to the village right now.
The way Zoar leaders see it, there are three main options under consideration. One is fix the levee, which would require significant construction.
Some things that we are considering are cut-off walls, which is essentially a wall that's constructed beneath the foundation of the dam that goes to a suitable depth that we think that would prevent future seepage.
That work could cost in the neighborhood of $100 million. The second option would be to pick up the village and its historic buildings and move them to higher ground, what Sandyville did back in the 1930s. Or 3, the government acquires the town and essentially tears down all of Zoar. Village residents worry that this has appeal.
Probably the least expensive one would be to acquire the town and destroy it. It would mean that we would lose 90% of the historic structures in this community.
While that may seem a financially attractive idea, Corps planners point out that in their study process, the numbers aren't the only thing they're analyzing.
We're not taught to look for the least costly alternative. We're looking for the alternative that has the best benefits, and that could be quite a bit different. I mean, if we spend $10 and get $15 worth of benefits, or we spend $100 and get $200 worth of benefits, we're looking for the $100 plan because you've got a $100 net difference there.
And Smith points out that saying there are 3 alternatives is premature at this point.
And really, we haven't designed one alternative to this point. I understand why the public foresees that as the big 3. But it's important to remember we haven't identified any alternatives. And there are alternatives that could combine a combination of structural and non-structural measures, I will say. Actually, initial raise on projects like this can sometimes be up towards the 40 or 50 different types of alternatives. And then we whittle those down into a final array.
The study is very rigorous and intensive. It requires us to collect a lot of data, a lot of information, be very comprehensive and thorough in our analysis. And then it also requires us to be comprehensive in considering all potential impacts. So that's what we're trying to do. It's not only a report to document what a cost of a rehabilitation would be, but it's also to consider all the impacts that might be associated with any particular plan that's ultimately selected.
It's significant to recall that the Zoar Levee was originally built to protect the village. Even then, it was seen as a place of value worth saving.
So I think a lot of people recognize that both the history of Zoar, because it was one of the longest lasting communal societies, is important.
We do know that the sink was here because on the floor, if you come in, you can actually stand here. There's an indentation where the women would stand here.
And then what we have here is a real architectural and cultural gem. So in the lower area of town here that would be affected by the levee being here or not, about 90% of the historic buildings are here. There's probably 45 historic buildings still existent in Zoar, and 90% of them are in this lower area. And we think Zoar is a historic resource, historic and cultural resource of national significance. We're on the National Historic Register. We are currently beginning the application process to become a National Historic Landmark.
All things that would seem to bode well for Zoar's future, especially since the government saved the village before. But in this case, don't hang your hat on that precedent.
With this study, we're kind of starting at square one. We have to reflect all that tradition and history and all that information, but it doesn't necessarily dictate what the outcome is going to be on this study.
With uncertainty still hanging over their future, Zoarites, just as their ancestors, are taking nothing for granted. They continue to spread the word about the value of their village.
Well, it's important to save Zoar for a number of reasons, but basically one of the things is that it's so unique that there's nothing like it in the whole country that's preserved as a living historic village.
I don't believe there's another town around like it.
There's no place else that you can go and see and experience and understand that period of history between 1817 and 1898. If we didn't have Zoar, where else would we go find something like this? When people begin to think that a historical item of nature is no longer needed, the past is lost. And when that past is lost, you don't get it back.
It is vitally important to have Zoar around here. We need to preserve this part of our history. It's just a small portion of the local history of this area. It needs to be not only preserved but shared with the rest of the country so that they know where we came from. If we don't know where we came from, we have no idea where we're going.
There are people that care about Zoar or care about our history and are saying to them, please listen to us, please hear us in what we have to say on it. And I think the message is getting out, and I think that perhaps with the things that are going on in the next 18 months or so, I hope that we'll see a positive outcome for Zoar.
That outcome should be known in April of 2015, when the Army Corps of Engineers hopes to select a plan for Zoar.